Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are in this world of ours. I truly hope you're safe and sound. I'm Aaron David Miller, a senior fellow at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, and welcome to Carnegie Connects, a series of discussions on issues of critical importance to America and to the world. I apologize for the delay. I'd only offer the following three words. It's Washington. Today, we're going to talk about the Israel-Hamas war, and I'm pleased and honored to welcome to the program Ambassador Michael Herzog. In the interest of time, I'd go through the ambassador's extraordinary, distinguished career. In the interest of time, I think I'll only add the following. I had the honor and privilege of working with Michael Herzog during the 90s, when there was a serious hope of promise and possibility across the board, but particularly on the Israeli-Palestinian issue. And I've always found him not only to be an extraordinary analyst, but a person of enormous integrity and honesty. I appreciate that, and so does everyone who knows him. Ambassador Herzog, welcome to Carnegie Connects.
Thank you very much, Aaron. It's a pleasure to be with you, and thank you for your kind words.
You deserve them. I know this is a sensitive time. I'm going to ask you a number of questions. You may or may not be able to answer them, but I appreciate the fact that you are willing to come on. Let me start with one intriguing thing that you said, sad and tragic, I think. I think it was a day or two after the Hamas attacks on October 7th. You said, I think, that on October 6th, Israel was one country. On October 7th, it was another. I can't imagine saying that about the United States either before or after 9/11. We're a much larger country, bigger country. What did you mean by that? And have your views on that issue changed in the last 7 months?
Yes, I did say that, and I would repeat it. And there's a deep sense into what I said. As you know, Israel has experienced a lot of crisis, wars, terror campaigns, and the likes, but nothing compares to October 7th. I was a combat soldier in the 1973 war. We were surprised by the armies of Egypt and Syria. We paid a very heavy price of 2,000 fatalities in the IDF in that war. We ultimately won militarily, but there was never such a deep sense of, it didn't touch an existential nerve the way October 7th touched. Then we had armies fighting each other in open terrain. Civilians were hardly involved. In this case, Hamas carried out a massive invasion into Israel with over 3,000 terrorists, followed by heinous atrocities, murder, beheading, burning, and mass kidnapping. This is something that touched the very fundamental sense of security among Israelis. And that sense will not be restored, I think almost all Israelis will tell you, unless we remove the threat. And that's what we're trying to do in Gaza. So when you talk to Israelis, everybody will tell you this is existential. It's not existential in the sense that Hamas in and of itself threatens the existence of Israel, but the significance of this is that if we do not defeat Hamas, they will regroup and strike again, as they have done and as they have vowed to do. But others in the Iranian-led axis will also be emboldened, and we will not be able to live normal life unless we remove that threat. That's why I said Israel of October 6th was one country, and Israel after October 7th is a different country. We are a nation in trauma, but there is a deep sense, this touch really a deep nerve, existential nerve in the state of Israel.
Is that sense of acute vulnerability still as acute 7 months on? I mean, the World Happiness Index has Israel as the 10th happiest country in the world. I just wonder, Israel's a strong and confident country. It's a powerful country. Is the acuteness of that threat still clear
Israel is a strong country, yet people feel vulnerable and people feel under attack and threatened. I think the nice thing about Israel, you mentioned this index of happiness, is that Israelis learn to live with the threat, live on their daily lives and so on. But yet there is a deep sense of vulnerability there. And this is also informed by the fact that we have tens of thousands of people who are refugees in their own country, people who had to leave their homes in the southern part of Israel, facing Gaza. Whole communities were burned down. Just visited Be'eri a short while ago, and it is terrible to see the scenes there. And tens of thousands of people had to leave their homes along the border with Lebanon because Hezbollah has been firing on a daily basis into Israel since October 8th. So yes, while we are a strong nation, and I believe that we will prevail, there is a strong sense of vulnerability.
Let me ask you about that, about the threat itself. I think you said a day or two after October 7th that the objective of the Israeli Defense Forces would be, the ground campaign hadn't started yet, to destroy Hamas's military machine, organized military machine. I think that's how you described it. My question is, this week is the 7th month of this war. I wonder how you would evaluate Israel's objectives 7 months on, and what is the relationship? I know you know this as an astute analyst of international politics. Military power is an instrument. It's an instrument to achieve a set of hopefully realistic and effective objectives. So I want to ask you to define victory, at least not yet, but how would you define progress toward the goal that you identified?
Well, you have more than one question there, and I want to address them one by one. When this war was forced on us, we set two major goals for ourselves in this war. One was, by way of general characterization, to move the threat, to make sure that October 7th can never happen again. In practical terms, this means to destroy the military infrastructure and capability of Hamas, what I call the Hamas war machine, and to remove Hamas from power in Gaza, because we understood that if we do not remove them, they will do whatever they can to rebuild their capabilities and strike again. And the second main goal was to bring back home our hostages. We did one hostage deal, releasing over 100, but there's still 133. Unfortunately, not all of them are alive, including 3 Americans held by Hamas as we speak, and we're trying to release them. In terms of destroying Hamas's military capabilities and removing Hamas from power in Gaza, I think before I analyze what we achieved and what we haven't achieved yet, let me say that what we face in Gaza is an unparalleled challenge for any military across the globe, because what Hamas managed to do since they took over Gaza in a bloody coup in 2007 was to build a very, very big, extensive military terror machine inside Gaza. When the war started, we had close to 40,000 armed people in Gaza, Hamas, Jihad Islami, and other groups. Nearly 400 miles of terror tunnels, complete with everything, thousands of rockets, all their brigades and battalions deployed there, production facilities for rockets, command and control center, all was there. And all was built under civilian population, using them as human shields. This is a big, big challenge. And militarily, I think we made progress beyond our own expectations. Yes, we paid a heavy price, we're still paying, but we managed to dismantle most of their organized force. By way of example, Hamas deployed in Gaza in 5 brigades and 24 battalions, like an army of terror. We believe we dismantled over 18 of the 24 battalions, nearly 19, I would say by now, and 4 of the 5 brigades. We did that, and we developed doctrine to fight in the subterranean, which we didn't have when the war broke out. I think their arsenal of projectiles was severely depleted by over 90%. They fired a lot of it, but we also attacked some of it and destroyed a lot of it. And I think we destroyed most of their production facilities for weapons. So any way you look at it, and in terms of their fighting force, I think we incapacitated maybe 2/3 of their fighting force. It takes time. It's not something that could be done overnight. That's militarily. As we do that, of course, we have to take care of challenges that come with it, the humanitarian challenge, another challenge. But the big question, I think you alluded to it, has to do with alternative to Hamas. As you destroy Hamas, what alternatives do you build? This is a long and a complex issue. I will say that what we don't want to see in Gaza is Hamas rule. We don't want Israel to occupy Gaza, and we don't want chaos. On the other hand, we want to demilitarize Gaza so that even after Hamas, it will not pose a threat, and we want to de-radicalize Gaza, because what happened there was, education of a whole generation to hatred and to animosity. And we've seen all of that burst out on October 7. The question of building alternatives is a very complex one. I don't take all the time in discussing this question. I will say that we all agree, our government and the US government agrees that the alternative to Hamas has to be based on local governments by Palestinians from Gaza, and there are elements in Gaza who are not Hamas. There is a big challenge of providing security to this local government's body when it is set, and providing security so that the remains of Hamas will not destroy it. And this comes with a big dilemma, because in order to be able to build alternatives, you have to bring Hamas to a breaking point. And we are close, I believe. We are still not there. We are talking about several alternatives, local forces that can do security, Arab elements that can do security, and we are talking to Arab countries, both our government and your government, and some other alternatives. It's a very complex issue. It also requires a mandate for whoever controls Gaza and a political horizon. These are very complex political questions. We are thinking about them, but I believe that in order to reach what we call a day after Hamas, we first have to complete the job of removing Hamas from power and destroying its military capabilities.
Yeah. When I interviewed General David Petraeus several months ago, we talked a little bit about this, and he referred to the clear hold and build approach that the Americans used in Afghanistan and Iraq, successfully at times, but ultimately unsuccessfully. And I guess the question that I would ask you is, and it's critically important, destroying Hamas's organized military structure is one thing, but as you destroy and you vacate, Hamas seems to, at least their civilian infrastructure, seems to be poised to return. And since clearing, holding, and building, you're not going to build in Gaza, since you readily admitted that you're not going to occupy Gaza. How do you manage that problem?
You're right. This is a dilemma. We are not in a pattern of hold and build, in the sense that we do not want to hold Gaza. And what we've done, our concept was to first, I think that's the right concept, destroy their organized force, to dismantle their battalions. Once we do that, we have freedom of action. We can go in and out with small forces and deal with the remains. For example, we fought very hard against their strongest battalions in the city of Gaza, in northern Gaza. We destroyed them. We pulled out our forces, and after that, when we had the information that they are rebuilding a big command and control center in the Shifa hospital, we were able to go there with much smaller forces, surprise them, and we're very effective in our operation and with hardly any collateral damage. That's basically our concept. We do realize that once we do that, there are still a lot of armed people who are affiliated with Hamas on the ground. And what we do is we conduct intelligence-based raids. This is a long endeavor. We have to identify the point where Hamas is at such a breaking point where we can start introducing alternatives on the ground. This also has to do with a discussion of Rafah, because there are, of the remaining battalions, 4 battalions are in Rafah. We haven't touched on them. And I don't believe that we can complete the job of defeating Hamas in Gaza without addressing this question. Of course, we understand all the complexity of that situation. But this is, there are also, by the way, smuggling tunnels connecting Egypt and Gaza through Rafah, and that also has to be addressed. So we haven't reached that breaking point where we can start introducing viable alternatives, and we have to identify the right moment to do so.
Yeah. Returning Palestinian governance to Gaza is a complicated process, but it's going to require legitimizing whatever Palestinian Authority, whether it's the revitalized Palestinian Authority the administration talks about or some other particular function. It's going to require bringing legitimacy. And that's probably going to mean that Gaza first cannot be Gaza only. But that gets us into the issue of an end state, and we can perhaps touch on that later. You raised Rafah, so I want to continue to ask you about Rafah. 4 Hamas battalions. Tell us why Rafah is so critically important. I understand the importance of destroying the remainder of Hamas's organized military structure. What are the other elements that compel you to devote the time and attention that you appear to want to devote, must devote to Rafah? Why is it so important?
You know, unfortunately, what should have been a tactical discussion of how to overcome a Hamas brigade in Rafah has become a strategic issue that everybody quarrels around. As I said, we cannot complete the job of defeating Hamas without dealing with these battalions, because if we don't, we leave them intact. They could serve as a nucleus for Hamas to rebuild its capabilities. I dare say that if those battalions remain intact, I see it very, I don't see any outside force going into Gaza, like Arab forces or others. Before that job is completed, they will not go into Gaza for as long as Hamas is there with this type of capabilities. We have to seal the Egypt-Gaza border, and that's part of what we need to do. As you know, a few days ago, we conducted a very limited operation along the Egypt-Gaza border. With a small stretch of land, we took over the Rafah crossing, which is also a source of funding for Hamas, an important source of funding. So we're also trying to choke them financially. And there are terror tunnels there, smuggling tunnels between Egypt and Gaza that we have to deal with. And there are hostages in Rafah. We know that. And I'll tell you more than that. We have villages and kibbutzim facing that area, and people will not go back to their homes if you know that there is a Hamas brigade across the border. You mentioned 9/11. We're not talking about thousands of miles away. We're talking about hundreds of meters away. That's the nature of the threat. Now, that being said, we are mindful of the fact that Rafah is complex in the sense that there is a big population. There are not local population, indigenous, but people who came from other parts of Gaza when we were fighting there. So when we started the discussion of Rafah a few weeks ago, there were 1.4 million people. We understand it ourselves that it is not wise to operate in such a densely populated area without moving the population that is not originally from Rafah, and without providing shelters and humanitarian solutions and all that. And we developed plans in that sense. And by the way, since we started that discussion, already several 100,000 moved away from Rafah to other parts of Khan Yunis, Mawasi, and other parts of Gaza. We understand that we cannot operate in Rafah without making sure that there will be a continued flow of humanitarian assistance, because most of it goes through the Egyptian border. And we understand the sensitivities of our peace relations with Egypt. I will say that in the last few weeks, we embarked on a very constructive dialogue with the administration about Rafah, where we shared insights and thoughts. And we had very professional discussion about the humanitarian situation, about military tactics, about many other things. And I think we listened carefully, we adjusted some of our plans. Unfortunately, we are now at a different point where our differences are now out in the public, in the sense that the administration says that it will withhold certain munitions to Israel if we do decide to go into Rafah. This is very unfortunate. I think it sends the wrong message to Hamas and to our enemies in the region, puts us in a corner, because we have to deal with Rafah one way or another. There are different ways of doing Rafah. We can talk about the tactics and the timetable, but as far as Israelis are concerned, I think there's a broad consensus about that in Israel. This is not something that we can ignore. Nobody presented to me or to us a strategy of defeating Hamas without dealing with Rafah. I've not seen it.
You know, at the beginning of when you answered my question, you talked about, you seem to suggest that Rafah has been sort of elevated from a tactical issue to a strategic issue. And I would just offer the following assessment. You have perhaps the most pro-Israeli president, I would argue, almost without a doubt, in the history of the US-Israel relationship, who has, for any number of reasons, made a sort of strategic decision, a strategic assessment, that it is impossible for you to deal with those Hamas battalions and not wreak grievous injury and harm to the 1.23 million Palestinians. Rafah's initial population was 300,000. Now the population density ratio in Rafah has got to be incredibly high. So you're suggesting that there may well be a way to reconcile the administration's concern about causing an exponential rise in Palestinian deaths and a humanitarian catastrophe with dealing with the battalions. I mean, is that a fair assessment of what's possible? Is there a balance to be struck there?
As I said, we had long discussions for weeks now with the administration about Rafah, and we told them point blank that we're not going to move automatically into the urban area without first developing a plan for the population and implementing a plan for the population. As I said, originally, most of the people who are there are not from Rafah. They came from other areas in Gaza. And I assume that if they have alternatives, most of them will leave that area, and they are already leaving. In recent weeks, hundreds of thousands left. So, and we told the administration that what we're going to do is not time-based, it's condition-based, and we showed them our plans. And I think it's unfortunate to me that before we completed that discussion, and we are about to continue that discussion, things went out in the public in the sense that, don't do Rafah, and if you do, we'll withhold certain weapons. I must say, as an Israeli, this is unacceptable. And I have full admiration for the president, for his support for Israel since the beginning of this war. There's no doubt that the US support to Israel was extremely meaningful and very significant. But at this point, where we are trying to find common ground in Rafah, I think going down that road is very unhelpful to this kind of a dialogue. And as I said, it sends the wrong message in the region. We are in the middle of a big effort to try and reach a hostage deal. And the last thing all of us want, I'm sure the administration doesn't want that either, is for Hamas to think that time is on their side. Because if they think so, there will not be hostage deal.
No, it's a fair point. But as you know, everyone has pressures and constraints they're trying to balance. Your government has them, and so does the Biden administration.
I understand that. What I was trying to impress is that for us in Israel, as I said, this war touches on existential nerves. And when we say that we have to defeat Hamas, I think there's broad consensus in Israel that we have to defeat Hamas, and we cannot leave part of their force intact. We just cannot do that. Now, as a former military person, I can tell you there's more than one way of doing it. There's more than one way of doing it. But the very notion that we have to deal with that force, I think, is not something that is negotiable for Israelis. As someone said, I believe it was one of our ministers, when you have big fire, you don't extinguish only 80% of the fire. You have to extinguish it all.
I mean, what the president seemed to have said, though, is a sort of a carefully scripted sort of, call it a red line. Sometimes, as you know, Mr. Ambassador, red lines, when they pertain to Israel, have a way of turning different colors, sometimes pink. They don't remain red. And I think somewhere along the line, if there's not a disconnect, would you seem to be suggesting that it is possible to move Palestinians into areas where there is access to potable water, shelter, sanitation, and adequate medical care?
The short answer is yes, and we developed such plans, and we kept developing them and improving them, because there are areas in Gaza where they can move. We were ready to provide shelter. We bought tens of thousands of tents, big tents for families, and other regional actors also have participated in this effort. Today, in southern Gaza, in the southern part of Gaza, south of Gaza River, there are 7 field hospitals alongside the other fixed hospitals. And there are more and more solutions. There are new water lines open. By the way, I think that as far as the humanitarian situation is concerned, there is a real surge in the last 4 or 5 weeks, a real upsurge in the inflow of humanitarian assistance. We have today 4 crossings directly from Israel into Gaza. 3 of them go to northern Gaza, which was disconnected in the past. We opened the port of Ashdod as a hub for humanitarian assistance into Gaza. We have the Jordanians sending every day dozens of trucks, including military trucks, through Israel directly to Gaza. We just conducted several pilots of the maritime corridor, and in the near future, the US-led initiative, the JLOTS, will be open as well and will contribute to that. And I could go on and on. There's a lot going, and it is our policy to flood the zone to the extent possible, because we understand, first of all, it's our obligation, but we also understand that in order to be able to realize the goals of this war and to defeat Hamas, we have to address this question.
It took a long time, though. I think you'd concede for Israel's efforts to facilitate more humanitarian assistance. I mean, it was only after U.S. pressure that Kerem Shalom was opened. I think the president several weeks ago threatened to change policy if Israel didn't change its policy with respect to facilitating humanitarian assistance and more trucks, whether they reach 500 a day pre-October 7 levels or not. There was a greater effort. But just can you explain to me why on the humanitarian aid situation, why did it take so long to produce more cooperation and energy on your side? Was it the fact that Hamas is holding hostages? Was it a concern over diversion of aid by Hamas? I would have thought this would have been part and parcel of a military political campaign almost from the beginning.
So it was never our policy from the beginning to deny humanitarian aid into Gaza, to block humanitarian aid to Gaza. That was not the policy. There were discussions about the levels of humanitarian assistance and how to get it in, and there were serious challenges inside Gaza. Gaza has been a war zone. It's not that simple to provide humanitarian assistance where fighting is going on. And so many people were moved in order to get them out of harm's way. And there are also pressures in Israel, you're right, by people who said we also have a humanitarian issue, which is our hostages. What about them? How come you're going to flood Gaza with assistance? And nobody said, we have to deny them basic water or food necessities, but people say, how come you're going to flood the zone when our hostages are there? And there were pressures inside Israel. But again, it was never our policy to block humanitarian assistance. There were a lot of practical challenges. I can tell you I was involved in this from the beginning. I spent hours a day, beyond what I imagined that I would do as an ambassador. I have a PhD on trucks and also types of assistance and calories and all that. And it took a while to bring some of these efforts to fruition, like the maritime corridor. It took several months until we reached an agreement with the Cypriot government and with other regional governments and so on. It took a while. Let me also remind you, when October 7th occurred and Israel was still under the trauma, the first decision our cabinet took was to close off all crossings into Gaza. By the way, all of them were destroyed by Hamas on October 7th. You talk about Erez crossing, it was destroyed by Hamas. Carnegie crossing was destroyed by Hamas. All of them were destroyed by Hamas. And the immediate intuitive response in Israel was, let's cut off everything and let everything go through Egypt. And it took a while for Israelis to realize that the inflow from Egypt is insufficient and we have to open more crossings. And then gradually we opened Kerem Shalom and Erez and Zikim and Ashdod. But I need to emphasize, it was never ever our policy to deny humanitarian assistance into Gaza.
Your critics have charged, I know, and I was going to give you a chance to respond, that in fact Israel has used food as a weapon.
That is totally untrue. Totally, we have never used this as a weapon. Never. We had our challenges, we had our dilemmas, we had our debate, but we have never used that as a weapon, never.
I wanted to talk, we have about 8 or 9 minutes remaining. I wanted to talk to you about the US-Israel relationship, but I have one broader question, which is really hard to answer. In the wake of 9/11, we didn't have a proximity problem with Al-Qaeda or the Islamic State. And I understand the reality that you have a proximity problem with Hamas, and you have a proximity challenge with the issue of finding a better pathway for Israelis and Palestinians. But I have to ask, and I understand in the wake of the October 7 attacks, the indiscriminate killing, willful killing of Israeli civilians and soldiers, the sexual predation, the raping, the taking of hostages, and the trauma that impacted on the people of Israel, its sense of vulnerability and security. But I have to ask you, the costs of prosecuting this war against Hamas, an organization that embedded its military assets below, in and around civilian populations and civilian structures, has been a terrifying price. The exponential rise of Palestinian deaths, the humanitarian catastrophe. And I know there are no rewind buttons on history, Mr. Ambassador, but was there another way?
You know, I could give you a long lecture about this. I will say this. When this war was forced on us, we didn't start this war, we didn't ask for this war. I think all Israelis will tell you we had no choice but to go into Gaza. There was unanimity about the need to conduct a ground operation because we understood that we cannot destroy that war machine only from the air. We have to go in and destroy it. And as I said, the challenge there is unparalleled. I don't know any army that has to fight in tunnels, 380 miles of tunnels, and such a big force. The US, when it fought in Mosul, faced 3,000 to 5,000 terrorists, no subterranean, and it took you 9 months. Nobody was standing with stopwatch over your heads and said, when do you end this war? Which is what's happening with us. Everybody's asking us, when do you end this war? Now, obviously, every war is ugly and every war is a tragedy. I myself was a soldier in a war, and every fatality is a tragedy. If you ask me if you had any alternative to go into Gaza, the answer is no. Did we make mistakes? Obviously, yes. Nobody's perfect, and we all make mistakes. I think there are several things that we could have done better, but the basic reality is that we had no choice other than to go in. And yes, we are paying a price. First of all, our soldiers are risking their lives inside Gaza. We still have hostages, and this really is extremely painful to our society. Our society is still in trauma since October 7th. And the war itself in Gaza is extremely complex. We take a lot of precaution in terms of hitting uninvolved civilians. But here I want to take a minute and just say that I have a big issue with all the numbers coming out of Gaza. People so easily and freely cite numbers which are essentially Hamas numbers. The only numbers of casualties in Gaza are numbers which are given by the Hamas-ruled Ministry of Health. I believe we have good reason to believe, if we had time, I could prove that they are inflated. And they never give you a breakdown of terrorists and innocent civilians, never. And they deliberately inflate the number of women and children at the expense of the number of men. I have a long lecture about this. That being said, every loss of life, Israeli or Palestinian, is a tragedy.
And they're in war, as Secretary Blinken has said, there are no hierarchies here with respect to Palestinian lives and Israeli lives. I want to ask you one additional question about the US-Israeli relationship. You've been a student of it. You've been a participant of it. It rests basically on three foundations: a high coincidence of shared values, a high coincidence of shared interests, and a strong basis of domestic support. I mean, you don't have to say it. I'm concerned that there is great stress on all three of these dimensions of the relationship now. Partly it's because by any analysis, the current government is the most right-wing in Israel's history. Plus you have polarization in American politics that has never occurred on this issue. Do you worry about the trajectory of this relationship?
It is my job to worry about Israeli-American relations, and I think about it long term. I see the trends. I follow what's happening here in this country, in the US. I follow what's happening among the youth. I see what's happening on campuses, follow that very carefully. I still believe that there is a solid basis uniting us, and I see it a lot in many places. But yes, our relations are under pressure. I don't talk about our side of the equation, but I will say that I worry about the level of political polarization in this country and how it impacts our relations, because the last thing I want to see and we want to see is Israel becoming a partisan issue or a political football here in this country. I've worked very hard to avoid that and to prevent that. I'm very much concerned about some of the trends that I see here. And you know, I really think a lot about the long term and the trajectory. I have thoughts about what both of us could do better.
It's a fair point, and I would agree with you. One final comment. My main concern about the future, and in the end, there will be a future. The war will end. My big concern, Mr. Ambassador, is that when it's all over, or when this phase concludes, that Israelis and Palestinians are going to look at each other, and they're going to say, you know, the problem is not that we don't understand one another. It's that we understand one another only too well. And I worry, and I think you do too, that there has to be a way to create some space, some mechanisms, some pathways to ensure that that mentality does not set in. Because if it does, we're bound for an inexorable and inevitable future of continued confrontation and violence. I don't want it. You don't want it. Palestinian public, I believe, doesn't want it, and certainly the people of Israel don't want it either. I want to thank you for being on this show, Mr. Ambassador. It's a tough, difficult, sensitive period, and you've answered, and we've had a good conversation. And again, I'll stand by this. What's always impressed me about you is your clarity and your honesty. And I want to thank you for that again.
Thank you very much, Aaron. It's been a pleasure.